Welcome back to my close read of Pride and Prejudice. We're now starting chapter 15, and I want to read the opening paragraph because there's a lot here to unpack. So the opening paragraph is, Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of his nature had been but little assisted by education or society. The greatest part of his life has been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming at it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a great deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head living in retirement and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsfield was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank and his veneration for her as his patroness, mingling with a good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obscurousness, self-importance, and humility. Now time to unpack that. Starting with the first sentence of describing Mr. Collins as not a sensible man, we need to look into the word itself, and I brought up my laptop for this to kind of confirm what most likely the definitions of these, because we have to remember during this time there was this trend, this period of sense versus sensibility, and literally Jane Austen wrote a whole book kind of looking into it with her two main female characters embodying the two sides of this conversation being had. And to kind of more accurately describe what it is, sensibility was a cultural and literary term for acute emotional sensitivity, deep empathy, and responsiveness to one's environment. Rather than meaning prudent and practical as it does today, it describes someone whose elastic nerves made them highly attuned to beauty, tragedy, and the feelings of others. It is feeling and responding dramatically. Think of kind of like a theater camper kind of person, like a little bit dramatic, a little funny, but they're feeling something. And we see it actually being personified with Mrs. Bennet. Her feelings when something happens, she needs her salts, she's put to bed when Lydia, runs off with Mr. Wickham. It's this dramatic sense of feelings that can lead to sickness, as we see with Marianne. Her dramatic sense of feelings led to her being sick, that, kind of coming into this idea of like a broken heart could kill you kind of thing, that like they feel things so grandly, but it's also kind of trying to be like, but we're experiencing the world and appreciating it grandly, like you're not reserved in the sense, you're not cold, you're not distant, showing things in this grand idea, if that makes sense. But in comparison, they're saying that Mr. Collins is not sensible, which, according to Shakespeare's words, this website, sensible is more like sensitive, responsive, capable of feelings. So what they're saying is that he is incapable of feelings, that he's not sensitive, he's not responsive, and that is further demonstrated by putting my laptop down and getting the book, by the description of Lizzie saying that he has this like a good authority of himself, that a good opinion of himself, his authority as a clergyman, his right as a rector made him altogether a mixture of pride and obscureness and self-importance and humility. And we're seeing that like he thinks so highly of himself, he's so focused on himself and this impression of himself and rising for himself and all these things, and he talks over people and he leads the conversations, but the conversations all tie back to himself and maybe Catherine de Bourgh, who is to help elevate himself. So you're seeing not a responsiveness in other people, like responding to other people's conversations, situations, engaging in them. He's not sensitive to other people's situation, as we will come to see. He rather loves that, the downfall of the Bennets, unless it wounds him with Lizzie and Mr. Darcy's situation. And then also like capable of feelings, and he's incapable of feelings. He's incapable of judging, for example, how uncomfortable the girls feel. He charges on because he's so wrapped up in his own head. And that can go into like a whole other thing where you can talk about like, maybe he might be autistic, or maybe he's just that misogynistic. Think of the world that we live in now where girls can't just say no, I don't want to go out on a date with you, or no, I don't want to give you my number, because guys think that's impossible. Like, you would have to come up with an excuse, but even then they don't like the excuses that you come up with to try and preserve their feelings. So there's a lot to unpack with just that. And Mr. Collins as a character, the more like on the surface, he's just a funny character to have, and someone to help push Darcy and Lizzie together, and add tension that, like, there's kind of a deadline for the girls to get married. But at the same time, him as a character, Jane is not just using him as a means to an end to add tension. She's creating a very fascinating character when you take a moment to really then dig into him. He is a fascinating character that would have been very prevalent in her time and extremely prevalent in our own. Moving on, one of the lines then early on is that he had spent the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father. And I kind of want to touch the illiterate part, but also kind of don't want to touch that part, because I don't quite know what she's trying to talk about there. But one part of me wonders if she's having this conversation of like an illiterate man, so you're then dependent on what other people teach you, tell you, to learn your moralities, to learn about the world. So it's biased, but also created a situation in which then Mr. Collins felt superior from where he came from, that he's trying to then shrug off from where he came from, thinking like, I'm one of those amongst the men, I'm social climbing, I'm going to continue to climb, and doesn't really talk about his past. He's talking about his present with his good fortune with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But also, like, I wonder if Jane Austen's having a conversation about literacy, because I think it's about this era that schools are becoming a little bit more commonplace for lower classes. Like, she technically went to school, and she has mixed feelings about school because, like, that's where her and her sister got sick and they returned. But she grew up reading tons of books thanks to her father, and had the place that they could be literate and have a wider understanding and view of the world. And we're just starting to see like schools be introduced for lower classes. So like it only would be a positive to educate the lower classes, because having a smarter society means that you're more likely to advance, but also more likely to have compassion, more likely to, be less like manipulated, like to not be as swayed by someone's telling you how to think and feel, because you can now form your own opinion in theory. And as I'm talking about this, I'm like, well, this relates to today, as for instance, America's literacy rate decreases and declines, and we're more now dependent on what people say online, as I am doing so myself. I see the irony of this, but we're dependent on what other people say, and don't then take the time to go do our own research, to do our own readings and interpret. And even if we wanted to, some people don't know how to interpret said readings. And so is Jane Austen having a conversation here that Mr. Collins kind of had a hard start because of his father being illiterate and his lessons coming from that. However, he should have improved because he was able to learn, able to go to university, where then he should have expanded. But yet she's, I think, having a comment about nature versus nurture at the same time, like, because she says the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society. So it's saying like the deficiency in nature. So like in his nature, he was always going to be kind of self-centered and proud, but education, society should have like lessened that, should have improved him. But his father, maybe the early childhood upbringing really influenced him more. Like, I think she's having a conversation about that possibly too. So what do you think a little bit? And I will come back and dig more into this. If you're watching on YouTube, obviously it's just the next clip, but if on TikTok, you're going to see me coming back in a different outfit talking more about this paragraph, because there's more here to unpack. Jumping back into this opening paragraph about Mr. Collins, I want to move on to the line that says, and though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming at it any useful acquaintance. And my mind was just running wild, thinking of what this could mean. Because what they're trying to say is that he hasn't formed any acquaintances, hasn't formed any friendships outside of it to help him or, guide him, very similar to like Bingley and Darcy. That Bingley and Darcy are helping one another in maturing and guiding each other through this world. So it makes you wonder what kind of person Collins was like in university that has deterred so many people from close friendships. Because especially if say he was power hungry, he could have latched on to a more established, titled fellow student, but he wasn't. And I think that tells us a lot about his personality and like the type of person that even though he's trying to socially climb, it's going to take a very certain type of person to allow him within their circle, which is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. But most others see through him, see through what he's trying to do, and probably are rightfully annoyed by his pompousness. Because I feel like, especially with fellow men, it makes it a little harder because you're on equal footing almost in the gender aspect of it, whereas then like he gives a little bit more deference to Lady Catherine de Bourgh for being higher in social standing but also a woman, and I think that helps a little bit more than say if she was a man. The next line I want to touch on is the subjugation in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. And we're seeing very much of the era of the weak head, assuming that like maybe he was just born to not acknowledge or take in his like the goodness and think very much of himself, or it's a way of kind of looking down. I can look more into it if I really want to, but more so I want to get into how his father had taught him great humility of manner. So his father had taught him good things too. Like we think very poorly of the father based on the perspective given, like for instance that Mr. Bennet and his father had fought previously, but his father had taught him manners and taught him humility of like respecting his betters. However, with Mr. Collins, it didn't work fully because he then sees himself as better than his illiterate father as he gets to go to university and interact with better people higher in society, and he thinks he's one of them and he thinks that like he is better than them. And yet, as I just pointed out with the university, he didn't make any long-term acquaintances, so he's very false. He's not a genuine friend and a social climber, and he thinks himself so important. And also that like he's living in retirement, he's not really doing his work, as pointed out in a previous chapter, that as a rector he only cares about births, deaths, and marriages. He doesn't, what that's trying to say is that he's not engaging with his community. He's not engaged in helping and interacting and listening and being a compassionate ear, and all these kind of things for his community, what a rector should be, a sounding board, an aide, someone helping those, being charitable. No, it's just a job that makes him look good, to hold him above those other people. And it's a stepping stone because he now is expecting to get this title, to become a landed gentry, and thinks that this will make life easy, not recognizing the job that it is, that he's living in retirement. He's not recognizing the job he has now, and he's not recognizing the job that he thinks that he's going to inherit. That being a landed gentry, you're in charge of the land and most likely tenants, that you're in charge, like you have power and influence and sway and expectations to take care of those on your land, to be a part of your community, to help them. It's not just for you and them to work for you so you live easily. Like that doesn't make a good landed gentry, as Jane Austen's trying to point out. And as we see, like Mr. Darcy is a good example that he genuinely cares about his tenants. We see it with Mr. Knightley when he gets involved with his tenants and helps the young farmer. And we see it with, say, like in Mansfield Park, I want to say Mr. Fairfax, and I'm blanking on his name, and it drives me crazy because he's one of my favorite characters, is Henry. But when Fanny points out his lack of care for his tenants, he actually goes and tries to be a better landowner and is involved in his tenants' lives as in a way to impress her. But it's having a conversation of what it really means to be landed gentry. It's not just have people make money for you so then you can go live a luxurious retirement like life. No, there's a job to it. And it's not going to be sustained if you don't have, consider it a job, as we see in not Northanger Abbey, in Persuasion, with, why am I blanking on everyone's names? But why they have to then decrease their cost of living and rent out their home is because they're not really taking the consideration of prospering and furthering their income and caring about those there too. There's a lot of conversations to be had there with this, but like the point I wanted to get at is that he's also jumping ahead, assuming this, and that can lead to your downfall. A conversation that even Charles Dickens had in Bleak House, and like all those people, the continuous almost generations of people who thought that they were part of this unfinished will that was in court for decades. A lot of them died early and in poverty because they were not trying to live their lives as it is. They were living expecting luxury, and in the end there was no money it left in the estate after all the attorney fees and all that. So that's kind of what's happening here, of like living expecting something that may not be. As case also in Persuasion, like who's to say that Anne's father wouldn't have a child? That's why the cousin tried to seduce the friend who was kind of making her way, and basically was afraid that what if he has a son and I'm out of the inheritance now. Like he saw that threat. So like this is a continual conversation being had in Jane Austen stories, and probably things that she saw a lot is people assuming something instead of enjoying the life that they have. And then if say they get a windfall, appreciating it. And then I think that I want to point out is like something that I work in a financial like advising office. I'm not a financial advisor. I don't understand fully, but a lot of our clients that are millionaires that have passed that threshold, most of them have done it because they have not lived outside their means. They actually still live in rather smaller houses and smaller budgets, and they have saved so much money and are going to be great for retirement because they're not spending past what they earn nor change drastically once they have reached that point. And that's kind of a conversation being had here too. So at least I think so. I don't know, there's a lot of conversations I think Jane's trying to have a lot about, like, I think being a part of an ecosystem and community, and how big community is to then have a functional society versus egocentric people who are just out here trying to have fun for themselves, to live only for themselves. It is very well known that Jane Austen stories are marriage stories. They talk about relationships and marriages, and that in part it's because that's all females were allowed to think about during that time. That was their main goal in life, was to find a good partner to have a family with, which actually we still exist in that kind of sentiment today. We still exist in a world where relationships and marriages are held to esteem, that it's a checklist that we have to check off. They have better benefits than singles. That's a different rant, but it's the conversation I'm about to get in here is still present today, which is Jane Austen in all her books is highlighting marriage and relationships, but the good, the bad, the variety of it, and how you go into it and how you view it will kind of dictate what you get out of it. And she's all about balance, as I will highlight, because with Mr. Collins, she's saying that having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. What is saying here is partially good, like having a good house and a sufficient income sometimes is painted very well, as we see in other Jane Austen stories and other stories at the time of like young lovers holding off or having a long engagement until they have a sufficient enough income and a good household for them to then be able to support their wife and raise their family, because wives can't really typically have jobs, so it's dependent on him. And we're going to see like Lydia's choice of Wickham was a bad choice because he can barely you know, sustain himself. He doesn't have an income and a household. They're kind of nomads, which isn't terrible for Lydia, but also isn't perfect. I think she probably likes moving around, but probably would also love to have a house to brag about. But getting back to Mr. Collins, the problem with this is that he's viewing it like a checklist. I got a good house, I got an income, now I need a wife. Like, there's no chance, there's no romance. It's just, I gotta do this. It's the next thing to check off on the list. It's like, all right, I got a cart, I need a horse. There's no digging into it. It's just not viewing the other person as a human being with their own emotions and feelings, as we've already seen illustrated with Mr. Collins, and as we will continue to see with Mr. Collins, that he's just trying to fulfill a checklist, his own needs, not taking into consideration the partner, a woman, and doesn't listen to them, as we continue to see with him. And it's frustrating, and you see like that's his downfall, but you also see why then Charlotte Lucas ends up with him, because she feels that pressure to check off that box, and she's like, I have to, and I can't be romantic about it, and I'll make do. And it works for the two of them mostly, but it's not going to be a very truly happy life or relationship. It's just making do. And I think that's the problem, is that like he's so self-centered and so fixated. Is I keep getting a slight autistic vibe to him, but I can't tell you if he is or isn't. But it feels very like, okay, do. And that may be wrong. I might be wrong thinking that's an autistic trait. I'm not entirely sure, but I get this impression that he's very socially at least awkward and very, let's follow, like he has these very intense ideas of what things are and should be, and he is in the world, and he doesn't actually acknowledge the world around him and other people and all these kind of things, if that makes sense. To continue with the previous comment of him having a good house, sufficient income, he now is seeking a wife, and he sought reconciliation with the Longbourn family, which he's seen already that their house is already his, and he's like thinking that he is helping, being charitable, to marry one of them. And as I said previously, to quote Brennan Lee Mulligan, to reach a hand down to someone, they need to be beneath you, and he sees these girls as beneath him. And look at him being so charitable, but he's not really being considerate of them. He sees just easy pickings in his head. He thinks they're desperate, they're gonna lose their home, they need me, so yeah, this is my home anyway. And the other context that we should think about is at the end that he meant to choose one of the daughters if he found them as handsome and as amiable as they were represented by common report, which it's very interesting that they're being spread around as being so handsome and amiable, but he's saying if. So that's a big criteria for him, which is like so surface level. There's no depth to it. He's just like, if you're good looking and not annoying, and a very broad misogynistic society standard of annoying, not personal, because he's annoying, or at least it's hypocritical of him, then yeah, I'll marry you. There's no preference. And you see it with him in a few minutes looking at Jane being like, well, it's the eldest, so according to society standards I should marry the eldest. But Mrs. Bennet then points him towards Lizzie and goes, yeah, that sounds right. He's not looking at the girls as individuals and seeing which of these girls would match with me personally, and my vibes and my personality, which one of us can mesh well and make a good life. Because as many people point out in the fandom, many people think Mary would have, and we see Mary's at least fascinated by him, and I think it would have not advanced Mary into being a better person and true happiness, but in this moment in time it would have worked. She thinks that they would have been good partners, but he is so broad and so guided by societal stereotypes kind of things. It's like those kind of men are like, well, I just want a hot girl, and it's like, okay, what else? And to quote Swan Princess, she's beautiful, and what else? Like, how to lose a girl in 5 words or less. That's what's happening here. And I just like, I love this paragraph because it is perfectly and succinctly and subtly showing us what kind of person Mr. Collins is and what kind of person you're probably going to run into on the marriage scene or dating scene. And they're just so fixated on hitting this check mark and thinking about themselves that they're not really thinking about how you and this other person could potentially mesh. They're not thinking about the other person's wants, feelings, or opinions because you're so fixated on what you want, which kind of I think goes into the movie Obsession that just came out, but I don't know because I haven't seen it. I've just seen a lot of videos talking about obsession, so it feels very much like this too. But yeah, it's just that, and it's frustrating. And I think that's what makes Mr. Collins is such a brilliant character, because she makes such a frustrating character comedic at times. Like, he's so frustrating, he's comedic and relatable, because we've all come across someone like Mr. Collins in our real lives and dating or just interacting with. And that's what's brilliant about Jane Austen. So as we know, Mr. Collins has come here looking for a wife, and it's pretty much stated by our narrator with them saying, having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking in reconciliation with Longbourn family, he had a wife in view. In seeking, as he means to choose one of his daughters if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. What this is saying is that he is coming to check a box off, that he sees them as interchangeable, a wife as a kind of like a object to owned. That doesn't matter. He's not taking in the personality and what would be a good person to live with, that would be a good partnership, even beyond just themselves. He's only looking if they're handsome and amiable. That's it. He's not thinking about who would make a good rector's wife, which Jane Austen's father had a very similar role to Mr. Collins, and his wife would have had a similar role of what would be expected of Mr. Collins's, which is those women, that the rector's wives would be a heavy influence on the society, on their community, that they would be the person that would be doing charitable acts, setting up events, that they would be the listening ear for fellow wives to be able then to vocalize to her husband, who can then vocalize to the Lord. She would be a very important figure in the community. And so you would want someone that would be capable of such tasks as that. And also kind of represent the ideals that he's sermonizing, you would think. So you would want someone that could take on this load, which I think Charlotte Lucas can do. But the other aspect of this is this someone that would be a partner for you? And also, Mr. Collins, not actually, I think he's never takes the time to figure out what would make him happy, because it could be fine to have a partner in which is almost like a work partnership, that you have your roles, I have mine, and we live almost separate lives, but we get along fine. But if you're expecting kind of romance out of it, or love, or whatever, then you're not going to get it. Like, I think Charlotte gives exactly what he is expecting here, but not more than that. And I think that leads to his disappointment. But I am slightly colored by having recently just watched The Other Bennett Sister, and I'm currently reading that. So I'm thinking in that text terms, and not so much of what's going on here. But one could still theorize that Mr. Collins is a little unhappy with him then overly involving himself in the affairs of the other Bennett sisters, like Lydia and Lizzie, less for his own reputation, and I think to more so rub it in to flaunt and make himself feel better. But at the other point of this I want to talk about is also the unsaid thing, which is that he's taking advantage of them. That he's taking advantage of their situation, which already they're existing in a society where women saying no to proposals is on the rare side. Does happen, but less expected, and often, unless there is an obvious reason against the man, the woman would be then judged. So he's walking in already expecting a yes thanks to societal standards, but on top of his already inflated ego. But you also have to take into account that he is fully aware of their situation, and he's taking advantage of them being in a situation in which they would be, in theory, even more likely to say yes. No matter, he could have just walked in right now without even spending the weeks courting them, and made an offer, and he would have expected a yes no matter what, and it would have been proven wrong, but in that moment he was expecting a yes, and so he's taking advantage of their situation, which I think is very quietly, because Jane Austen never outright talks about it in this book, but very quietly it's her kind of putting forth this other component of marriages going on in her time, and even today, but like especially during her time, of people taking advantage of other people's situation, putting them in a situation where like it's not going to lead to happiness, most likely going to lead to misery and an imbalance in power in a society that already has an imbalance of power, because he's taking advantage of the situation of him being the one that would inherit and them having nothing that they need to marry in order to survive in the world. So here's an interesting thought I just had, which is that Mr. Collins so quickly and easily changed his course of action. Initially, the first day he is pursuing Jane, thinking she, being the eldest, should get his attention according to standards, I don't know, and being very pretty and all that. But then the next morning, upon a slight hint, but no, Mrs. Bennet is probably not as much of a hint, but he is also, Mr. Collins can't take subtlety, transitions his attention to Lizzie very easily, in this saying that Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. And the thing that I just realized is how similar it is to Mr. Wickham, yet we do not admonish him as much as Mr. Collins. In the text, we admonish Mr. Collins, but we do not acknowledge how Mr. Wickham quickly changes who he's pursuing, from Lizzie to then, I am blanking on her name, but the young lady who has a fortune, how quickly he pivoted all his attention then onto her. And Lizzie understood, and she was slightly offended, but took it with good faith. She went, all right, whatever, I'll move on. He wasn't meant for me anyway. And then quickly changed to Lydia. But we, like, it is talked about, but like not hated as much. Like, we give him more leniency, but he's doing the same reason as Mr. Collins is. He's pursuing a wife, but in like Wickham's, it might even seem more species pursuing for money. So I don't like, the thing I'm trying to get at is that I have a cold, so I'm trying to process my words. The thing I'm trying to get at is that Mr. Collins and Mr. Wickham mirror and foil each other, as many other characters do, which I've talked about many times. Case in point, Mrs. Bennet and Caroline Bingley share a lot of things in common, much that they would hate to hear, but so does Mr. Wickham and Mr. Collins. When it comes to marriage and love and how they interact with others, it might be night and day, the way that Mr. Collins interacts with women versus Wickham, who's much more suave, but the way they go about things and the way that they treat other women is very similar. I want to continue my conversation from the previous video, which is about Mrs. Bennet so easily influencing Mr. Collins to transfer his feelings from Jane to Lizzie. Now, his transference of feelings, as I previously mentioned, does have a tone of misogyny to it, of him just viewing all women the same, that they're interchangeable. However, upon me reading the other Bennet sister, as I'm actively doing so, that story puts him in a more sympathetic light than, say, this story, which sees him slightly antagonistic, but more so comedic. The thing that I'm realizing is that he is suffering from a very similar thing that Jane Austen talks about in a lot of her other books, mostly for her female characters, but she supports the idea of getting out into the world, that being stuck in your small town community, a lot of cases for the females, it's, then you're dependent on the hope that either you find someone, or pray for the chance that maybe you find someone within your community to marry and they end up being a genuinely good person and a good match, or hope that someone comes into your community that could be a good match. And it's still all a risk, a lottery, a chance. And Charlotte Lucas kind of highlights this with like her seizing on Mr. Collins is because she doesn't know if there's going to be another new person coming into town. Yes, they happen to have 3 young, suitable men coming in the same short period of time, but obviously Darcy is looking down on all of them except for eventually Lizzie, and Bingley has only eyes for Jane. So, like, you are working in such a finite kind of resources with a lot of competition. Unless you leave your community, then you expand your world, you expand your options, as we see in the other Bennet sister, Mary, finding true happiness when she leaves her small community and finds more like-minded people, more weird people like her, and is out of the shadow of her family and the role that they even unknowingly put upon her. So it's the same with Mr. Collins here, is what I'm trying to get at, is that he has not experienced the world, and that is to his detriment. You can surmise based off conversations here that it's just been him and his father. Yes, there might be female maids, but no one of his standing, one could say, that would represent women or interacting with other women, especially if, for instance, it seems like his father kept to himself. We don't hear much of the mother. She probably passed. So it's just him and his father. And then he goes to school with other boys. And so, and the other boys, you can guess maybe the women that they were interacting with were not of a higher standing or to be used in a way, one could maybe argue, but I am just theorizing. But at the end of the day, his first true interaction with women and women of class is Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter. So then he's basing his assumption of all women and like womanhood on these 2 women. And, you know, he hasn't really seen much to show a diversity of what women are like. So he assumes they're all alike. So what I'm trying to get at is that because he also was kept within a small bubble, he also has a failing, has a detriment. So Jane Austen continuously arguing is that by going out in the world, by expanding your social circle, you grow into becoming a better person, that you're probably gonna be more well-rounded, that you're more educated and have a better chance of finding partnership because of it. So it's like a bunch of things like that. To continue, because I'm still not done talking about this, which is very fun for me, but it's evidence also that like one simple interaction, one simple line, I can go on for videos. You can go on forever talking about and just picking at. And so when Mrs. Bennet swaying Mr. Collins from Jane to Lizzie, the thing that I had kind of like epiphany or a thought about yesterday while I was reading the other Bennet sister, which is, why did Mrs. Bennet do this? Because you would think that her best chance would be to promote Mary, someone who is more like-minded to him, and especially for Mrs. Bennet, who needs to marry off all her daughters. You would think that she would then push Mary onto him, because especially as her chances seem least hopeful, but she doesn't. So why doesn't she? And I think there's a couple different things going on here, and a lot of it comes down to pettiness. Mrs. Bennet is not good nor bad. Her circumstances suck, but she also has gotten away with a lot of things and is not the best person in society. Definitely annoying, but not terrible. And like, you have a duality of feelings when you feel for Mrs. Bennet, but I think there is a pettiness to her, and a very similar one that we see in Lydia. But I think that she's jealous of Lizzie being Mr. Bennet's favorite, of her being beautiful and intelligent and witty and able to buck up against social expectations, but doing so within the confines of social expectations. Like, she's able to push back while still not doing it to the detriment of the family, not causing a stir. And I think that frustrates Mrs. Bennet, that Lizzie seems to move through society so easily while adhering and not adhering to the rules, and is accepted and loved by so many. And I think she wants to punish Lizzie for that, but simultaneously I think it's a part of her pride too, of not wanting to see her role, Mrs. Bennet's role, being replaced by someone like Mary, someone like Charlotte Lucas, who are not quite beauties, or glitter in social settings are accepted so widely as Lizzie does, because I think at least she could then argue me like, well, I could easily breathe letting know that my heir, my inheritor of my role is equally as perfect as I was, like that kind of argument she's having. So it's just interesting to then sit and think of Mrs. Bennet, and I think it's her pride got in the way in this moment of truly succeeding, because if she truly wanted to succeed, she would have pushed for Mary. She would have put all her effort behind Mary being chosen by Mr. Collins, the same amount of effort that she put behind Lizzie, and not taking into consideration anyone else's feelings. She was just thinking about her own pride in that moment, her own pride of wanting someone worthy of inheriting her position once Mr. Bennet passes, someone, but at the same time kind of harming Lizzie, retaliating against Lizzie, and maybe in hopes, while she does not like Mary, knowing that then there's someone to be by her side, a partner, someone to serve her, a companion. And if Mary's married off, then she wouldn't have that. So there's a bunch of things, but at the end of the day, I think it comes down to pride. It's Mrs. Bennet's pride blinded her from a better choice and blinded her from acknowledging that Lizzie was never going to say yes. Lizzie is not that kind of person to have so easily said yes to something like this. Upon encouragement from Mr. Bennet, Mr. Collins then joins the girls, minus Mary, to walk into Meryton, and it's because Mr. Collins followed Mr. Bennet into the library following breakfast, very much puppy-like, which to me that shows that Mr. Collins, while trying to seem confident in himself, is not. He's following very puppy-like, trying to emulate the role that he knows he's going to be inheriting. He thinks that this is what a gentleman does. He then goes into the library. I need to mirror Mr. Bennet. But it's not him, as he cannot sit there quietly and read as Mr. Bennet does. He constantly is talking. And even at the end, we get this line, Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely pleased to close his large book and go. And there's a couple things here of like, I think, again, him going about in a awkward way of trying to learn the role that he's going to inherit, but simultaneously, like, he's young and wants to get out and be free, but has never really had social interactions. And at the same time, I'm also wondering, like, this is the man that's constantly preaching down to others, talking down to them, but does not read much himself. So it's like, are you not forming your own ideas? Are you just vocalizing what other people say? And that should be evident, I think, with him constantly saying, well, Lady Cavendish said this, Lady Cavendish does this. So he's more of a parrot than a thinker. And I think that can be dangerous as someone like a preacher, that the role he has, which is leading the community in morality and stuff, that he's just vocalizing what one strong voice is saying. That could be bad. But there's a lot of other thoughts you can unpack here, I think. As I previously mentioned, Mr. Collins is a fascinating character, thanks even more to me actively reading The Other Bennet Sister, because based on your perspective of him, you view him a little differently. I view him very differently, because in the version of Jane Austen, it's so easy to view him in a very misogynistic kind of way. Though I think she's kind of presenting someone in argument for men not to be like. But we have to remember she is focusing on Lizzie and her experiences, and Mr. Collins is meant to be kind of a roadblock to push her towards Mr. Darcy, to act as a foil to Mr. Darcy, which I will point out in a minute. But in The Other Bennet Sister, he's much more sympathetic, and with that I realize, or have this idea, that maybe he just isn't worldly. Maybe he has not actually interacted with women, though I'm wondering how long has he been a preacher and interacted with his community. Does he not interact with his community that much? But you could also argue he maybe has not had to interact with women in a romantic sense, and that's kind of a different way of interacting with people when you're doing it romantically often. And you see here him just fumbling it, because as he's walking into Meryton with the Bennet sisters minus Mary, it says, in pompous snuffings on his side, and civil sense on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, and a really new muslin in a shop window could recall them. It's showing that he is so surface level, that pompous nothings, that he's not actually engaging in conversations. He's just saying nothing and talking down to them almost by the hints of the word of pompous. And based on society and civility, the girls are politely assenting, pretending that they're listening, but they're not engaged. He's not engaging them. He's not looking for a deeper level of them. He's looking at a wife in a very surface level, which is going to lead to his future unhappiness. But I get where he probably is coming from, because if he is looking at people like Fordyce's sermon, it's a very surface level presentation of women, that they're not engaging and looking at women on a deeper level. They're not. A lot of these books on conduct books, mostly being published for women, is very surface level. And if men read it, then it's a very surface level that men are reading, that they should be looking for in women. They're not looking for someone that actually is engaging, someone that would be a good partner for them, someone that would lead to their own happiness, because to them they're being presented that the best solution for marriage, outside of now having arranged marriage, because arranged marriages are falling away and it's becoming far more popular to have love matches at this period of time, is to then find a woman that pretty much you're looking for on a very surface level that you would have if you're having an arranged marriage. And yeah, like I think Mr. Collins in himself is very interesting. I'm kind of digging into Fordyce's sermon and writing something right now for that. Maybe that video will be out before this one. I don't know. But I'm actively researching on that. And the point I want to get at is that you could very easily argue that it's misogyny, that he talks down, or you could argue that he's just unworldly, that he just doesn't have experience. But at the end of the day, I think it's the response that is very big, and how it foils with Mr. Darcy, because Mr. Collins comes up against pretty much Lizzie. He's trying to pursue her, and he's doing it in a very surface level, but doesn't win because he doesn't realize the problem, and he doesn't try to change it in the way that Mr. Darcy does. Mr. Darcy, though, thanks to Lizzie actively pointing it out to him, she does not do that to Mr. Collins. She does not tell him outright what his flaws are. But Darcy does, and then he internalizes it and tries to grow and change, and continues to pursue Lizzie because he genuinely loves her, whereas Collins very quickly and easily changes his feelings then to Charlotte, who just gives him attention. He doesn't have to fight for it. He doesn't have to work for it. So what does that say about your partner then, when you have someone like that? So yeah, like even this line is very short paragraph, but it's telling us a little bit about Collins and engaging us in a conversation, and is equally setting up the foiling of Collins and Darcy as potential suitors for Lizzie, and why one is better than the other in a conversation with society Jane Austen is having. Upon reaching Meryton, the young ladies come across a new hot bombshell entering the villa, and it is that intense. Mr. Wickham's introduction is that intense. He is a good-looking young man entering a very small circle. Just like with the villa, anyone new all of a sudden becomes very interesting in Love Island. I don't watch much Love Island. I gain most of my information from like social media. But based on what I've known, anytime you have someone new come in, all of a sudden there's new fascination. That happens anywhere. Like, case in point, when you're in school and a new kid comes, to school, all of a sudden they're the most interesting person, even if they are not the most attractive person in a couple of senses of the words, whether it's physically or emotionally or, socially. Just their newness in a small pool makes them more attractive. And that's what's happening here, is that their community is so small, and most of these young ladies are not leaving this community. Jane and Lizzie are lucky enough that they are able to leave and go visit their aunt and uncle gardeners in London and the Lake Districts, but this isn't happening often. So most likely their dating pool is reserved to their community. And if they've already gone through their community and there's no one that they like or no one good enough, and as we've learned from Mrs. Bennet, Jane has had a few offers, but they are now dependent on someone coming into their community. And that's why the soldiers being there is so important. It's such a heavy part of the story, is that it's bringing in a huge influx of men to their community, a huge influx to their dating pool. And with that, there's a slight desperation and a slight lowering of standards. All of a sudden, the only thing that they need to know is that you're a soldier, and all of a sudden you're deemed more respectable. But then, as case in point with Mr. Wickham, he's not. He's not coming from a good background, and he has a lot of gambling debts, and he's not a good person. But because of this desperation and the pseudo respectability around the soldiers, all influences this. And I talk a little bit more about soldiers in a different video I made, which is the history surrounding Jane Austen. I talk about the philosophies that influence it, the soldiers, all these different things that heavily were influencing the story that was happening during Jane Austen's time. But getting back to this, the point I'm trying to make is that Mr. Wickham and even Mr. Collins appearing have slightly elevated chances than they would have under, I would say like a London circumstances where you are seeing a lot more people, or a better circumstances, but because they live in such a small community and there's such a need to marry, because there's not much of a way for young women to survive in this world without then depending on others. You can't quite work, especially a lady of their standing, which is about middle class, landed gentry, as Jane Austen has experienced in her own life. While she did work, Jane Austen, it wasn't a very comfortable life, and they still depended upon their family to, support them. And that was tough, and they felt that. It was very disheartening for the mother and two sisters. So it's just like a whirlpool, and I think Jane Austen is trying to very slyly introduce this conversation of like, maybe we should educate women, maybe we should allow them have careers or jobs or something to be able to support themselves, and then they're not dependent on men, which then puts them in a situation where they are then more susceptible to aligning themselves with terrible men. And then it would, in return, make men have to be better people because they don't have it so easy to find a partner. Because even Mr. Collins, as I previously mentioned, is not a good person, not perfect, but nor does he try to change because he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to work for it, nor does he want to, because Charlotte Lucas quickly comes in and marries him, so he really doesn't have to work. He has no motivation to. Whereas Mr. Darcy has the motivation, though he has the options, but he's a different person than Mr. Collins in the first place. To continue with Mr. Wickham's introduction, because there's a lot to unpack here, the first thing is his introduction. He is walking with Mr. Denny, and that does a lot to elevate him in the first place, because they're existing in a society which references was very important. It's very important to be able to enter community through references of other people. Like, you didn't enter someone's home, you didn't really enter a community without being a letter of reference from someone else, or acknowledgement of someone's relation or something like this, previous interaction. You're kind of supporting me and like, oh, I know this is a good person, because you can't do background checks really here, so you're dependent then on other people's interaction and then being like, no, this is a good person, you should interact with them, you should welcome them into your community. But as I mentioned in, again, my Jane Austen history video with the soldiers, all of a sudden it's in a weird place where it's almost lax, but they don't realize it because these men are entering and leaving communities so easily. And then you have this fantasized, moralistic kind of knightlyhood surrounding the idea of soldiers, elevating them in morality already. So like, they're elevated, but it's a false elevation, this false pretense, false first impression. Again, going back to first impressions, it might be right, but it's not guaranteed. Case in point, again, with Wickham. And even Denny being the one to introduce them, it's assumed he's a good person, but we also don't know much about Mr. Denny. All we know about him is based on Lydia and Kitty's impression. Like, I don't remember, at least, Lizzie or Jane saying much about him besides him being a nice person. They don't interact with him as much as Lydia and Kitty, and obviously they're not good rulers for morality. But even Denny's friendship with him doesn't seem like it's long term. We don't know, and it might be superficial, might be surface level, and he might be also blinded by Wickham's charm. The other important detail about Wickham's introduction is the superficial surface level of it, of how he initially catches our attention because he's a good-looking young man, and they describe him as his appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming. And so they're saying already, like, his appearance already put him in good favor compared to, say, Mr. Collins. He's a new person, new to hop bombshell to the villa, that essence. But everything he says is perfectly polite. He's doing everything just right, and he's eager to talk to them. It's not hard to talk to him. He's not proud, talking only about himself. It's very opposite of Mr. Collins' conversations with them. Literally, we were having, between the course of 2 pages, this difference between the two conversations. And then also, like, he's happy to talk to them, eager to talk to them compared to, say, Mr. Darcy. And so the conversation I'm trying to get at here, that I think Jane Austen is trying to get at also, is the superficial level of dating or courtship and how problematic that is. Because if you exist in a society that encourages the superficial level, then you're only looking at someone for being good looking, assuming then they're good looking, they're morally superior, and like position morally superior based off then just how they look, like their jobs, how they dress, how they talk. And that doesn't really give much, because then you have someone that could be a con artist, someone that could be really good at talking but really moralistically a bad person, versus someone like Darcy who's not good at talking to people but much more moralistically a good person. And they're existing in a world where the dating is also limiting it to being superficial. You know, most of your interacting with young men is often in presence of other people, and it has to be like the conversations are very defined and limited, what you can talk about most times, but that's also you're interacting with them maybe briefly on the street, most commonly at a small parlor, and even then you're not getting deep, you're not really learning much about the person. You're putting on a presentation, you're putting on a show at these parties, or you're introducing and interacting with them at a dance, and you're dancing, you're not talking. So you're basing your future happiness, your future partnership with such superficial levels, and how that is a result of why there's so much unhappiness, and why love matches even sometimes can be false if you're not giving people the time and the place to then dig deeper. And the reason why Darcy and Lizzie work so well is that they have that time to kind of dig deeper and learn more about one another, even within the confines of what is appropriate places for them to interact. I've talked a lot throughout this book so far about foiling and mirroring of characters. That Jane Austen's, a lot of her characters do that. Case in point, just within this very chapter, I talked about how Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy are kind of foils of one another when it comes to courtship. How not only physically they appear vastly different, but they both kind of face a situation, but the diverging parts is that Collins does not change. He finds the easy route and he's not digging deeper, whereas like Mr. Darcy might be more stingent, but that also pushed him to grow and change later. But what I want to get at here is that with Mr. Darcy and Bingley coming upon the group in Meryton where the young ladies are meeting Mr. Wickham, I'm now thinking about how Bingley and Wickham are kind of foils of one another. Based on first impression, they are both very pleasant company. They can hold conversations. They're very sociable. Others seem to gravitate towards their company. And side note, like, I don't know how much of this is like influenced by the media and like canon, because like now they're just meshed together in my brain. So like, I don't know if it's the actor's portrayal of Bingley in like the 95 and the 2005 version of this book, if that's influencing me, because I always just kind of picture him so like smiley and jovial and like good nature, and everyone, all the other actors seem to be engaged and hook onto his words and smile at him instinctively when he talks. So like I don't know how much of that is actually canon or how much of that is actors' choices, but still it's a similar thing with Wickham, that young ladies gravitate towards him, that they're all drawn to him, but they diverge. Where Bingley, while a little more naive, is good-hearted. He has a good nature, whereas Wickham is scheming and is not moralistically good in terms of like their society. He's a gambler, he's a cheat, he's a liar, he runs off, there's like no good honor to him. And I think the point of then having them kind of foil one another, it is very fascinating that both the eldest Jane and Lizzie are attracted to them, is to kind of have a good discussion, I think, about the gamble you take in courtship, especially during this time, but even today you can argue, but like the young ladies, if you're basing just on first impression, they seem like both good picks, but upon being in his presence a little bit longer, even before learning about what happened with Mr. Darcy, Lizzie was starting to get a little I'm okay, because he quickly turned his attention to a young heiress, and that quickly showed his true nature. So by being within each other's company and seeing how they interact with others is good, and you can learn more than if the entire focus is just purely on you, which I think is slightly the downfall of Jane and Bingley. But like you can tell they're obviously in love with one another, but like even here it's saying like, you know, Mr. Bingley was the primary spokesperson and his principal object of conversation was towards Miss Bingley. So it's like, what is he like towards others? How does he treat his servants? How does he treat others? We just so happen to know, though, in a previous chapter when Lizzie was staying at Netherfield, when he announced the ball, he talked about giving punch and soup even to his servants. So you see he's good-natured with that offhanded comment. I'm rambling, but point is, I think Bingley and Wickham are not perfect foils, but they are a little bit, and it's to, I think, emphasize the gamble you take in courtship if you're not able to really be put in situations that allow you to see the person, see them interact with others. If you're just confined to certain scenarios, that allows people to put on a good front at the very least. And it's kind of similar to modern day where people say that the best test for a relationship is to go on vacation together. It's very similar to that in my mind. There's a lot that I kind of just like stuck on when it comes to Mr. Darcy in this moment. That Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth happening to see the countenance of both of them as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effects of their meeting. Both changed color, one looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long know. And the reason why I'm so fixated on it was, I think, Mr. Darcy's interactions. That I love the readiness of Bingley giving civilities to others, greeting everyone in the group. It doesn't seem like Darcy is. And it's that, like, refusal to look until he finally, like, notices. Like, he wasn't going to acknowledge these other gentlemen at all. And it's like, I don't know if it was just because he was so determined to not look at Lizzie to, you know, temper his feelings for her, or if he genuinely doesn't look at other people. And what does that mean? Because I think he can be a good person. He's a good landowner, as we learn later in the book. But there's this like Caroline Bingley-ness to him here, that he is stuck up. And I wonder if he genuinely is like that, where he doesn't look at other people because he doesn't want to engage with other people, maybe afraid that they want to use him, or if he's being slightly influenced by being in Caroline Bingley's presence for so much that like he's subconsciously taking this on. So I'm like wondering more about this part of him, and then thinking about also him just deigning to return the salutation to Mr. Wickham. And I feel like it's such a tough situation because if Mr. Darcy snubbed Wickham, that would have probably inferred a little bit more of Wickham's bad character. But the problem is that Lizzie already doesn't value Darcy's opinion and already thinks he's snobbish. So, like, it wouldn't mean much, and she would probably go against him more, as case in point. So, you also then have the situation where Wickham can get to her first, and Wickham is much better with his words and is much more capable of swaying her until much later that Lizzie actually learns the truth of the situation. So, just this moment caught my attention, and I'm just like sitting here like I can't tell you exactly what's going on, and that's the beauty of it, but like I'm like struggling to even unpack it for myself. And it's just the detail of Darcy bowing, and you can presume probably mostly to Lizzie, but not even noticing the others. So is he deeming, like, for instance, Kitty and Lydia for being so young under, beneath his attention, like they shouldn't even be out of this classroom kind of sense, even though he has a sister roughly the same age, so you would think he's sympathetic, but his is much more well-behaved than Kitty and Lydia. And even not even acknowledging the gentleman. Is it out of jealousy that Lizzie is interacting with another man, that he's not even looking at this other man, even though he doesn't want to have feelings for Lizzie? He kind of does. Like, I don't know. And that's what's just interesting, like I'm saying, is it snagged my attention. It is very easy to blame mostly Mrs. Bennet for Lydia and Kitty's manners, but we have to also look at Mrs. Phillip, who I am almost positive, but now I'm starting to doubt myself, is Mrs. Bennet's sister. And I say that because as Lydia is like begging Denny and Wickham practically to come into the Phillips' house. One, that is rude. That is not her house. She doesn't have the place to invite them. And second, even though it's a family home, like it's hard because it is the country, and like it's a little bit more lax with manners, and then you have this strange time that they're existing in with, for instance, soldiers coming in and out, and the laxness of their interactions. Again, look at my Austen history. I talked about that a little bit. But Mrs. Phillips throwing open the parlor window and seconding it, that seems so unladylike. Almost as what they would probably describe as, in this generation, a fishmonger's wife yelling out her wares. Like, it seems so much like that. Like, to yell out her window, which, like, one, were you listening from your window? Like, what were you doing? And, like, two, to, like, throw open. Like, you couldn't have at least, like, pretended to be, like, just happened to come to the front door. Like, there's so many ways that you could have lied and feigned and, like, polite and calm invited them in, but no, it seems so silly. And I think, now that I'm thinking about it more, I think Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips are the older version of Kitty and Lydia. That Lydia and Mrs. Bennet are forces, and I think Phillips and Kitty go along, and you see that also with, like, Phillips and Bennet's interaction. But I think, like, that's Mrs. Phillips is equally encouraging Kitty and Lydia for their silliness, and is aiding and abetting them a little bit with her help. So there's more to unpack there, and I'll get into it later, but that was just my initial thought here, is the crassness of her too. Yeah. Previously, I mentioned my sudden realization of the similarities between Mrs. Bennet and her sister Mrs. Phillips with Kitty and Lydia, and is emphasized even more here as Mrs. Phillips had somehow come about with the information very similar to what her nieces had learned in person from direct sources, but had found out that, Mr. Denny had brought Wickham from London, and that he was to have the lieutenant's commission in the Shire. And she's such a busybody gossip, and that's exactly what Lydia and Kitty are. They often burst into the rooms at Longbourn. I was about to say Pemberley, but Longbourn, with the news of, oh, there'll be a ball. Oh, this is gonna happen. Oh, this is happening. The soldiers are coming. They're busybody gossip mongers, I guess you could say. Like, they're just so into it. And Mrs. Phillips, she had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street. And had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would have certainly have continued the occupation, but unluckily no one passed the window now except a few officers who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. So once again, you're seeing this parallel between the older sisters and the younger sisters of just sitting in the window, just watching people go by, which I think leads to boredom, the lack of occupation for ladies, but also for ladies like Mrs. Phillip and Mrs. Bennet and Kitty and Lydia, who were not encouraged or found faults in pursuing tasks that would have been entertaining to them. Like, they're not musically inclined, they don't really embroider much, they don't read much. It's not like they're trying to invent a new polish to clean their home with. They're not charitable. So what else do they have to do? Be busybodies and put their noses in everyone else's business. And that's all they have to do. And I guess you need someone in every community, but like, is that really a happy life if you're constantly involved in other people's? And I think this is a very, very subtle conversation Jane Austen could potentially be introducing, is having young ladies without any occupations like this, what you kind of deteriorate into, and is it true happiness? And then also your judgment of people becomes so superficial. Like, case in point of them, Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Phillips, Kitty, and Lydia all needing just the bare minimum. It's like, oh, he's a lieutenant? Well, all these other soldiers are stupid and ugly now. It's like, okay, they might actually be decent people. They might actually have more money than Wickham. But in comparison, on a superficial level, they're not as good looking. They're not a lieutenant. So it's all superficial. We also learned that some of them were to dine with Phillips's, I can't do that, the next day, and the aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. And what this is saying is, one, the Longbourn family is not invited to dinner, but the soldiers are. And I think, again, it's showing a very similarity to Kitty and Lydia, but more so Lydia, that I think Lydia would be very similar to this, of like, her parties are hosting soldiers or hosting men, a bunch of men, that she would be a flirt probably still with them. And like, you would categorize it as doing one for their country, feeding these young men and, you know, entertaining them. But like, it's so tough because they're coming in a community where like, it is very nice that the community is welcoming them and feeding them and giving them entertainment, especially before they go off to war. But at the same time, like, why does Mrs. Phillips do this? It's not like she has a son or a nephew in the regiment. So what is the point of doing this? And she doesn't even have a daughter to try to convince them to marry off. So what is her angle of doing this? One of the brilliant things that Jane Austen does in this scene, I just realized, is making Mr. Collins completely disappear. With the arrival of Wickham, Darcy, Bingley, and even going to their aunt's house talking, we all forgot about Mr. Collins till he is brought up towards the end. The prospect of such a delights were very cheering. They parted on mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room and was assured of unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. I completely forgot he was there. I completely forgot he had come with them because other more interesting men had come to the scene. And I think it's so brilliantly done by Jane Austen that me as a reader also forgot about Mr. Collins, just as the young ladies probably forgot about Mr. Collins, showing us how Mr. Collins stands in this dating pool, in this society, that he is very easily forgettable when someone more fascinating comes. He is distinct, but very easily forgettable that he is in the scene. So while I was reading the line, as I walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen, but though Jane would have defended either of or both had they appeared to be in the wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. And it made me realize that Jane and Lizzie equally gossip, but their version of gossip and talking about other people feels so different than Kitty and Lydia or Mrs. Phillips and Mrs. Bennet. The latter groups feel superficial, feels like they're trying to make themselves feel better, you know, put themselves above others. It's silly. Whereas Jane and Lizzie, while they're talking about other people and it can be malicious, they're at least talking about more than the superficial. Like, Lizzie, while she does not like Mr. Darcy, is equally trying to get at a deeper level. She's trying to understand a little bit more than the surface level of him, even though she doesn't like him. Trying to understand, see if it proves or disproves her current theory of him being a terrible person. But at least it's trying to get deeper, trying to understand more than just taking the surface level and being like, nope, everything is what I decided it is. Pretty much what Mrs. Bennet does with Mr. Darcy. Tells Mrs. Bennet, keeps praising about Mrs. Phillips and her politeness and manners, which gratify Mrs. Bennet. And he said that even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something he supposed might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in his whole course of life. And the funny thing about it is what I just said about her inviting the soldiers. There's no connections. We don't hear of any, like, nephews or cousins amongst them. She has no connections to them. They're not tied to, like, say, a friend's nephew or son or cousin. There's nothing, but she is welcoming them into her home with easy civility. And I think Collins is showing the old way of, like, that is very nice of her to bring him in, even though they had just met, but it's due because of the relationship with the Longbourn family, the Bennet family, and being kind of presented with the Bennet family, giving the value of, like, you know, his company, even though it was poorly done. Like, that doesn't mean anything, as case in point with Mr. Collins. He's not a great company, but in comparison to the soldiers who are coming with no references, with no connections, she's bringing them into her home. And that is fascinating if you start to then think about it more and unpack it more. And like I said I keep bringing up my Jane Austen history video I made previously. I talked a little bit more about soldier life here and the laxness of social etiquette and bringing them in the home, and like the moralization of them being just in uniforms and heightens and all these kind of things going on. But it just stood out so much more to me now that I just kind of realized how weird it was that Mrs. Phillips had invited these soldiers into her home. And there's so much more, like, I'm just sitting here thinking, like, just spiraling, thinking about it. It seems weird. And I never noticed it till this read through. So, once again, kind of during close reads, you unpack more layers to the story. So, this is why I do this kind of thing. But with that, that is the end of chapter 15. Thank you for watching, and come back for chapter 16.
Soundstripe.